28 years. That's how long my parents were married before my father dropped my mother off at the departure terminal at Vancouver International and told her to have a wonderful trip. She never made it to the gate. I only found out 3 days later when her best friend called me from Kelowna asking if my mother had arrived safely. I told her my mother wasn't going to Kelowna. Her best friend said, "Yes, she was. Your father called me 2 weeks ago to say your mother needed rest, that she'd been under so much stress, that she wanted to spend a few weeks by the lake." I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen in East Vancouver for a long moment, staring at the kettle. Then I called my father. He answered on the second ring, calm as still water. Said my mother had boarded her flight just fine. Said she'd texted him from the departure lounge. Said I worried too much, that she was a grown woman, that I needed to let her breathe. I asked him to send me the text. There was a pause. He said his phone was on low storage, that it had probably auto-deleted. Then he said he had to go, that he had a conference call, and he hung up. My mother's name is Sylvia. She's 54 years old. She worked for 22 years as a registered nurse at St. Paul's Hospital before she took early retirement to help my father manage the property portfolio her own parents had left her. 4 rental units in Burnaby and a commercial building on Kingsway that generated enough income to make her financially independent. She had a life that was entirely hers. She built it quietly, piece by piece, while also raising my brother and me, while also being the kind of wife who had dinner ready when my father wanted it and was silent when he needed silence. She was careful. She was smart. She was the last person in the world who should have disappeared. My name is Fiona. I'm 31. I'm a paralegal at a small firm in New Westminster, which means I know enough about the law to understand when something is wrong. And I knew, standing in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, that something was deeply wrong. I drove to my parents' house in Coquitlam. My father's car was in the driveway. He answered the door in his housecoat, which surprised me. It was 11 in the morning, and he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as measured. Not worried. Measured. Like a man who had already decided what he was going to say. I asked him to show me my mother's passport. He said it was with her. I asked him to show me her travel itinerary. He said she'd booked it herself. I asked where she'd stayed the night before flying because her flight would have been early. He said at the airport hotel. I asked which one. He said he wasn't sure. Every answer came just a half second too quickly, like he'd rehearsed them, but not quite enough. I walked past him into the house. He called after me, said I had no right, said I was being dramatic, said my mother would be furious when she found out I was snooping. I went into the kitchen and opened the drawer where my mother kept everything. Loyalty cards, takeout menus, reading glasses, the small notebook she used for grocery lists. In the notebook, on the last page with writing, she had listed her medications. She had a thyroid condition, managed for years with a daily prescription from her doctor in Burnaby. I knew she refilled it every 3 months. I went to the bathroom cabinet. The bottle was full. A 30-day supply, barely touched. She'd left without her medication. My mother was meticulous about that prescription. She'd once driven 40 minutes in a snowstorm because she'd forgotten to refill it. She would not have flown anywhere for any length of time without it. I looked at my father standing in the bathroom doorway. I looked at the bottle. I said, "Where is she?" He said I was overreacting. I left the house and called the non-emergency police line from my car. The officer I spoke to was kind but careful. He explained that adults have the right to leave without telling their families, that my mother hadn't been reported missing, that they need more to open a file. I gave them everything I had, her name, her description, the inconsistency about the flight, the medication. They said they'd make a note. They took my number. I sat in my car in my parents' driveway for 10 minutes. Then I called my brother. His name is Elliot. He's 28, lives in a condo in Port Moody that my father co-signed for, works at a logistics company my father helped him get hired at 3 years ago. He's not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. He's just someone who learned very young that our father's approval was easier to live inside of than outside of. and he built his whole life around that warmth. When I told Elliot what I'd found, he went quiet. Then he said, "Maybe Dad's telling the truth. Maybe she just needed space." I asked him why she left her thyroid medication. He said he didn't know. I asked him if he knew anything at all, about where our mother was. Another silence, longer this time, and then he said, "Fiona, I think you should just give it a few days." Something in the way he said it told me everything. I didn't say anything else. I just said okay and hung up. I drove home and I started making a list. My mother's phone went straight to voicemail. I called her carrier. I was listed as an emergency contact on her account from years ago when she'd added me, and they confirmed the phone had been inactive since Sunday morning. The day my father said he dropped her at the airport, the phone had pinged its last tower in Richmond near the airport and then gone dark. I pulled her Nexus card number from a document she'd scanned and saved to a family shared drive years ago. I contacted the CBSA tip line and explained the situation. I wasn't sure it would go anywhere. Then I did something that felt extreme at the time. I drove to the Vancouver International Airport and I walked through the domestic terminal, asking at every airline counter whether they had a record of a Sylvia. I gave her surname, booked on any flight in the past 4 days. 3 counters couldn't help me. The fourth one, a young woman who looked at me and seemed to understand that I was not a person who was coping well, looked at her screen and said quietly that she couldn't confirm passenger details, but that she could tell me there was no record of that name on any departing flight since Friday. My mother had never boarded a plane. I went to the parking area outside the terminal and I sat on a concrete barrier and I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I stopped because I didn't have time. I went back to the beginning. My father had driven her to the airport. Her phone died in Richmond. She had not boarded a flight. So what had happened between the drop-off and the gate? I thought about the medication. I thought about the Kelowna story. I thought about my father's face in the bathroom doorway. Not panicked, not guilty, just calculated. And I thought about something my mother had said to me once, maybe 2 years ago, when I'd asked her why she'd stayed with him through all the years of coldness and distance. She'd said, "He needs me to be useful, Fiona. As long as I'm useful, I'm safe." At the time, I thought it was a sad thing to say about a marriage. Now I understood it was something else entirely. I went to see her accountant. My mother had used the same accountant in Burnaby for 15 years. A quiet man named Gerald who had been handling the rental properties and the Kingsway building and her personal investments since before I was working. He was semi-retired, but he still saw my mother twice a year. I called him and told him what was happening, and he asked me to come in the next morning. He showed me 3 documents. 6 months ago, my father had asked my mother to sign a general power of attorney, broad, durable, covering all financial decisions in the event of her incapacity. Gerald had advised against it. My mother had signed anyway. When Gerald asked her if she was sure, she had looked at my father, sitting beside her, and said yes. 2 months ago, my father had used that power of attorney to begin transferring the rental properties into a numbered company he'd incorporated in Alberta, where he had a cousin. The transfers were still in progress. One had completed. 1 week ago, 2 days before my mother disappeared, Gerald had received a letter, apparently signed by my mother, instructing him to release all records and access to my father effective immediately. Gerald had not acted on the letter yet. He thought it was unusual. He'd been meaning to call my mother directly to confirm. I stared at the letter. I know my mother's signature. I've seen it on birthday cards and permission slips and the deed to the house I grew up in. What was on that page was close, but it wasn't hers. I photographed everything with my phone. I drove directly from Gerald's office to the RCMP detachment in Burnaby, and I asked to speak to someone about a missing person with suspected financial fraud. This time they listened. The detective assigned to the case was a woman in her 40s, unhurried, who wrote everything down by hand in a small notebook. I gave her the accountant's documents. I gave her the timeline. I told her about the medication. I told her about Elliot going quiet when I asked if he knew anything. I told her about my father's answers that came too quickly. She asked me, "Do you have any idea where your mother might physically be?" I thought about Kelowna. My father had told her best friend that my mother wanted to spend time by the lake. He'd needed a cover story that would hold for at least a few weeks. Kelowna was 4 hours away, plausible, remote enough that a woman alone might not be immediately noticed. But my mother didn't know anyone in Kelowna well enough to stay with them, which meant if she was there, she was somewhere she hadn't chosen. I told the detective all of this. She made a call while I sat across from her desk. I heard her say my mother's name. I heard her say medical facility. I heard her say BC Interior. She hung up and looked at me and said, "There's a private wellness center outside of Lake Country. They admitted a woman 4 days ago under a different name. The intake form listed a primary contact as her husband. They were told she'd had a mental breakdown." I couldn't speak for a moment. The detective said, "We're sending someone. I want you to stay here." I didn't stay there. I drove to Lake Country in 3 hours and 40 minutes. I called my brother from the highway somewhere past Hope, and I told him what I'd found. I told him what I knew. I told him I knew he knew something, and that if he didn't tell me everything right now, I would never speak to him again. And more importantly, neither would our mother. He started crying, and then he told me my father had told him 6 weeks ago, had sat him down and explained, calmly, that our mother had become erratic, that she'd been behaving strangely, that she needed professional help and she was refusing to accept it voluntarily. He said he'd found a place that could help her recover properly. He said he needed Elliot to stay quiet because if it became a family drama, our mother would never get the rest she needed. Elliot had believed him, or he'd wanted to believe him. I'm not sure there's much difference. He told me one more thing. The week before she disappeared, our mother had found something on our father's phone. She'd confronted him about it. Elliot didn't know what it was. Our father hadn't told him, but he said our father had come to him afterward and said, "She's not well, Elliot. This is for her own good." I arrived at the wellness center at 6:40 in the evening. The RCMP had beaten me there by 40 minutes. My mother was sitting in a small room near the reception area, wrapped in a blanket, and when I walked through the door, she looked at me with an expression I will never be able to describe properly. Relief and confusion and something broken open, and she said, "How did you find me?" I said I just kept looking. She'd been admitted under the name Lynn Hartley. The intake paperwork described her as a woman experiencing a dissociative episode following a psychiatric emergency. The form was signed by a physician whose license number, the detective later told me, had been borrowed from an obituary. The doctor had died 14 months earlier. My father had paid the facility in cash through a third party and had listed himself as the emergency contact under a variation of his name. My mother told me later what had happened at the airport. My father had bought her a coffee while they waited in the departures area. She'd been nervous about traveling alone. She didn't love flying, and he'd been unusually attentive that morning. Kind even. She said it felt strange, his kindness, but she was glad for it. She drank the coffee. She remembers feeling slow, heavy. She remembers my father's hand on her elbow, steering her away from the terminal, saying there'd been a problem with her booking, that they should sit down somewhere quieter. She remembers a car. She doesn't remember much after that. She woke up in a room with a locked door and a woman in pale scrubs who called her Lynn and told her she was safe. What my father had found on his phone, what she had found on his phone, was a series of messages between him and a woman he'd been seeing for 4 years. A woman who, it turned out, he'd been telling for 4 years that he was in the process of leaving his wife, that the delay was complicated because of the properties, because of the assets, because of the way the finances were structured. He needed more time. He was handling it. The Crown Prosecutor's Office laid charges 6 weeks after my mother came home. Forcible confinement, fraud, uttering forged documents. The financial transfers were frozen within 72 hours of my first visit to the RCMP detachment. Gerald's records and the numbered company documents gave them everything they needed. The Kingsway building and the 3 remaining rental units were preserved. The one completed transfer is still being worked through the courts, but Gerald says it will come back. My father's trial date is set. My mother is living in the Burnaby house now. She changed the locks the week she came home. She went back to her doctor and restarted her thyroid medication and started seeing a therapist in New Westminster who specializes in trauma. She is doing the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding herself, which I think she was always good at. She did it in her 20s when her own parents' marriage fell apart. She did it in her 40s when she realized her husband was not who she'd thought. She's doing it now. My brother called me 2 weeks after our mother came home. He asked if he could visit her. I told him that was her decision, not mine, and I gave him her new number. She picked up when he called. She always picks up for him. I'm still figuring out what I think about that. What I know is this. When my father steered my mother away from that terminal, he was counting on her being alone. He was counting on her having no one who would ask the right questions fast enough. He had spent 28 years making himself the center of her world, and he assumed that without him, that world would have no architecture. He forgot about me. He forgot that I had watched my mother my whole life, watched how she moved through difficulty, how she kept records, how she never threw anything away. He forgot that she had taught me, without ever saying so directly, that the way you survive is by paying attention. I paid attention. My mother is sitting across from me right now at her kitchen table, drinking tea, reading the mail. In a few minutes, we're going to drive to Burnaby Mountain for a walk because the forecast says it won't rain until evening, and she likes it when the inlet is visible from the trail. She told me last week that for the first time in years, she'd slept through the night without waking. She said, I forgot what that felt like, to sleep without waiting for something. I know what she means. I think she'd been waiting for a long time, longer than either of us had understood. She doesn't have to wait anymore. I keep coming back to the medication bottle. That's the detail that started everything. A prescription sitting almost full in a bathroom cabinet belonging to a woman who would never have left it behind. It was such a small thing, easy to overlook. And I think that's what my father counted on, that nobody would look closely enough, that the story he'd built would hold together long enough for the pieces underneath to be moved permanently out of reach. What undid him wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't a single moment of justice descending from somewhere above. It was just attention. Careful, stubborn, unglamorous attention. The kind my mother had modeled for me my entire life without ever calling it anything. I think about what it took for her to survive those weeks in that room. She woke up not knowing where she was, called by a name that wasn't hers, told by strangers that she needed to rest, that she wasn't, well, that the people who loved her had put her there for her own good. Most people in that situation would have started to doubt themselves. That's what the situation was designed to produce. And yet, something in her held, some part of her that had spent 54 years learning who she was, did not let go of that knowledge, even when everything around her was engineered to replace it. That's not luck. That's something she built, quietly, over a long time. A kind of inner steadiness that no one had handed her and no one could take away. She'd had to develop it through hard years, through a marriage that asked her to make herself smaller, through disappointments she never fully named out loud. She'd had to figure out, without much help, what she actually believed and what she actually valued. And then she'd had to live by those things even when it cost her. I don't think I understood that about her until I was driving through the dark past Hope, somewhere in the mountains between what I knew and what I was about to find. And Elliot. I've thought a lot about my brother too. He's not cruel. He just made a choice, over and over, to believe the easier version of events because the harder version would have required him to stand somewhere uncomfortable. He chose comfort over clarity, and it meant that for weeks, he knew something was wrong and said nothing. I don't think he'll forget that. I don't think he should. Because the cost of that kind of passivity isn't just personal. It lands on someone else. It landed on our mother. What I want, if any of this is useful to anyone, is just this. The people who harm the ones we love rarely look like threats. They look like husbands at airport departures, buying coffee, being kind. They rely on our instinct to smooth things over, to give benefit of the doubt, to not make a scene. They count on us being too polite to ask the hard questions twice. Ask them twice. Ask them 3 times. Keep the records. Notice what's missing, not just what's there. My mother taught me that without meaning to. She is still teaching me.